Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pocket Size Bio with Dr. Casco. In today's video, we're going to take a look at factors that affect the spread of disease. Okay, and this is essentially chapter 13 of the Nelson WACE textbook, right? Of the Nelson WACE textbook, Unit 4, right? And we're going to talk about the modes of transmission, right? And we essentially went over growth of pathogen population, density of the host population, and how um, their levels can influence the spread of disease. And the last one we need to talk about is mode of transmissions, along with other factors that can influence the interplay between these three factors, right? Ultimately, referring to the spread of pathogens. Okay, so we left off talking about the mode of transmission, right? So let me just get this in a bigger screen here. Okay. So the mode of transmission, as you've seen, right, in the previous lessons, right? It's just the way in which a pathogen can spread, right? Is it airborne? Is it soil-borne or waterborne? Could it be spread by sneezing and coughing and all of that, right? So uh, definitely mode of transmission can how depending on how difficult it is, can propagate easily a pathogen or um, inhibit, right, its spread relatively well, right? And ultimately, though, it's something that epidemiologists, right, and scientists need to study because imagine the cases where you have pathogens that are contagious and very virulent, right? So you want to mitigate and be able to stop the spread as much as you can, right? And it's especially a lot more difficult with those pathogens that have multiple modes of transmission, right? And uh, the mode of transmission does depend on how well the environment is for the pathogen, right? You could have, some instances where there is bad conditions in the environment, right? There's not that much water, for example, for those organisms that depend on water to propagate, things like that, right? So the phytophthora is a very nice example because you have, during good conditions where there's some good moisture in the environment, in the soil, you have these zoospores that can come in and just swim around to a susceptible host, right? Remember, Phytophthora dieback is basically a pathogen that moves around, from one root to another, right? And it needs some medium, relatively a small amount of water to pass through, right? Via the zoospores when you have good conditions. And in bad conditions where there are dry periods, right, they are able to also produce another type of spore, which I mentioned before, climatospores, right, that are produced to thrive in dry conditions, and they can retain these little spores and these new individuals um, that can thrive during the dry environment in a dormant state. And when the conditions improve, these spores can then propagate themselves, swim around, and complete the transmission, right? From a infected host to a susceptible host, right? So, yeah, it does depend on the conditions, right? That enables the mode of transmission. Okay. If you have several modes of transmission, this will greatly increase their spread, right? Ultimately, though, it does rely on the number of pathogens that you have in a particular population and the number of hosts that are in a particular area, right? So again, they're always interplaying together, okay? I want to talk about some other factors that are involved or that influence, right, the degree in which these three factors interplay, right? Pathogen population, host population, mode of transmission. These are other factors that, while they're not part of the three, right, they're uh, they do provide some input, right, to the degree of spread. One of them is globalization, right? And this idea of globalization is relatively recent, right? Where you have a lot of contact between humans, other plant organisms, right? Other animals, plant species, right? Across different continents, right? Initially, how do we get across from one place to another, right? Before modern transportation, it was essentially walking, right? Horses, ships, right? Which wouldn't go that far out and extensive and so forth. But with this idea of globalization, where you have this idea of being interconnected and continents being able, humans being able to move across all continents, essentially, right? Um, uh, what happens, right? You do increase trade, you do increase economy, you do increase travel and tourism and cultural exchange, but at the same time, you are, passing potential pathogens, right? So it's while it's a milestone, a breakthrough for civilization, right? It does come with some negative effects, if I can say, right? So you increase the efficiency of spread, right? The speed on which something could spread, right? Um, and so forth. And while you're getting new pathogens from one continent to another, this also increases the chance of getting new strains and different types of mutations, right? Different types of sexual reproduction occurring amongst pathogens, um, because they also are going to new species of pathogens, right? Um, and definitely tourism and just in general human migration, right, influences that. Okay. Aside from that, right, you have tourism and that whole, economy of poultry and livestock and produce trade, right, does influence, transmission and spread, right? Um, you know, some other facets of this idea of globalization is war, right? With war, you have a lead of refugees passing, trying to, seek safety and going to different countries, right? And so forth. And of course, that kind of brings different types of pathogens to and from different locations, right? And definitely, right, just normal trade of plant life, of animal life, of livestock, and the illegal trade, right? Of animals, right? So ultimately, all of this, would pass down pathogens, increase the chances of spread, right? Um, a very famous example is measles, right? Very highly contagious, right? It's a viral disease that spreads, through little airborne droplets, infecting people through sneezing and coughing. And you would get in Australia and Western Australia, you would have a good eradication of measles, right? For 20 years just by vaccination, right? We all should be vaccinated by measles and just trying to isolate this whole virus, right? But there's some individuals that do get infected and maybe they don't have a vaccination, right? An immunity to it. So what happens is there's an outbreak that occurred where you would have an international tourist visiting, right? Western Australia, or a Western Australian traveler going somewhere else, getting infected and coming back, you basically have an infection already and that could spread, right? So um, the thing in this does depend on the pathogen, right? You have a certain incubation period, 7 to 21 days. You don't even know you have it. Some people don't, are asymptomatic, right? Um, could easily, pass through a country, right? Now, Australia does rely a lot, especially with COVID, right? This idea of herd immunity that we're going to take a look at in chapter 14 to try to mitigate the spread um of pathogens. Okay. Another example was the African swine fever, which was endemic to, sub-Saharan Africa. And this was a disease that was spreading very, very fast, right? It was said to be endemic to this region and always present in this region. And what is this about? It's basically a pig virus, right? That was very, very virulent, right? That could spread between live pigs. Even the tissues of dead pigs can house the virus for a good period of time, or even their secretions, right? Their body fluids, right? And aside from that, you would get fomites, right? This virus could stick on, right, storage surfaces, shoes, clothing of people, of farmers that would be working with livestock that is infected, right? You have this big area, you know, um, um, that is having cases, right, of outbreak, right? And what contributed to this also was, and let me just kind of go a little bit higher here, right? Um, what contributed to this also was that farmers weren't reporting um their sick pigs, their sick livestock, right? And that gave big implications, right? So this African swine fever has been the biggest animal disease outbreak, right, in history. Killed more than a quarter of the world's pigs, right? Of course, pigs are being, consumed, traded, sold, bought, et cetera, um, across all of the world, basically. And the problem with this, right? Farmers in Southeast Asia, right, weren't reporting some of their livestock was sick. And because of that, right, people, produce and livestock was getting sick, spreading out even more than what the health officials could kind of detect, right, and basically look after. And the reason farmers would do that is because that would, this is their source of livelihood, right? This is their income, right? And if their pigs die, who's going to compensate that for them, right? So they would kind of rather just keep quiet, sell this infected pig and the produce produced by these pigs and whatnot, right? Rather than actually report, right, these cases. Okay, so an outbreak first reported in northeastern China in 2018, quickly spread through the country. More than 1 million pigs were culled, right? You guys know what culled means, right? And it was a big, big problem, right? There's a great decrease in produce, right? In terms of pork, right? So related concepts to what we're familiar with, right, is an epidemic, right, was being expanded through borders, essentially becoming a pandemic. And already an epidemic, right, is a sudden increase in cases, right, in the prevalence of a particular disease in a certain region or in a nation, right, in the country, following an outbreak, right? So an outbreak is that initial, kind of occurrence that is occurring, occurrence that is occurring, that is happening, right? Um, More cases are being reported and reported. In Japan right now, we're seeing some, cases, a rise in cases of this flesh-eating um, skin disease, right, by that bacteria. And if it continues, it can turn into an outbreak, which can turn into an epidemic. And lastly, you get a pandemic. I don't think it'll spread to that amount, but um, then you get a pandemic, right, which you get that spread throughout the world, right? So definitely, right, globalization has impacted, right, the spread of disease and also environment, right? Let's take a look at another concept that influences the spread of disease, which is climate change, right? And this is more related to mosquito-borne diseases, right? Um, and how is this related to mosquito-borne diseases? Is basically, rise in global temperatures, um, rise in weather patterns, right? Differences in weather patterns, more rainfall means more pools, means more areas where you can have mosquitoes breeding and laying their eggs. Eggs are developing and so forth. So you're getting higher population of mosquitoes, right? What type of mosquito-borne diseases, which we're familiar with already, is malaria and the Ross River virus disease, which gets passed down by mosquito vectors, right? So definitely it's affected by global climatic changes, right? The concept related to this is referred to as distribution, right? So the distribution of mosquito populations, right? It's basically that occurrence of these organisms and the cases, right? Based on certain patterns in geographical areas, right? Um, in which the spread is occurring, right? And what are we seeing so far with scientific data and measurements of change in temperatures, right? We know already how climate change works, right? What happens in this concept of climate change, right? You have an increase in global air temperatures and ocean temperatures. Because of this, you're having a change in global sea levels. There's a melting of ice and snow. You're having a change in water levels in the ocean. Also, due to differences in temperature, you're getting circulation, right? Current changes, right? Changes in the water and wind currents and so forth, right? So all of that is changing weather patterns. Okay. You could be having more continuous um, rainfall in certain areas of the world. You're getting dryness and droughts in other areas of the world. But those that are getting a lot of rain, you know, you could be getting more instances of breeding grounds for mosquitoes, therefore, higher modes of transmission and higher pathogen populations. Okay. Um, yeah, and also temperature, of course, right? Organisms tend to thrive more in higher temperatures, more moist temperatures, and so forth. Okay. Um, in terms of climate change and global warming, page 455 has a good review. Definitely take a look. We won't discuss the general concept of global warming, right? But you guys know already gases, these greenhouse gases are trapped. They trap solar energy that doesn't get reflected back into space, so they retains heat. So there's a rise in temperature. Okay, so make sure you review that just to make sure that you are familiar with, right, the climate change and global warming, right? Enhanced global warming, if you remember from unit two. Unit one. All right. So again, like I was mentioning before, right, distribution of mosquito-borne diseases is likely to increase, right, because of climate change. Okay. So um, warmer temperatures, there's more bodies of water because of higher rainfall levels. There's more mosquito activity, right? More breeding grounds. Okay. And definitely you see that a lot with malaria, right? And the Anopheles mosquito. Okay. So climate change, right? Globalization are some um, things that influence, right, the spread of disease. And then you have antibiotic resistance that we are also familiar with from, chapter 8 and 9 of when we talked about evolution, right? Um, Evolution is basically that gradual cumulative changes of inheritable, traits in a population over many generations, usually over a long period of time, right? It's very useful for bacteria because they have a high reproductive rate, right? Bacteria reproduce by binary fission, right? Within minutes, within certain half an hour to an hour, you can have dozens, millions of bacteria, right? Dozens. Um, and as they're reproducing, you could be getting mutations. You could be getting passing of plasmids, right, from one bacteria to another. And just those small changes is enough for a bacteria to become resistant or more resilient to an antibiotic, right? And therefore they could spread rapidly. Okay. So yeah, again, similar to mosquito-borne pathogens, changes in weather, changes in climate, right, can provide a, an environment for bacteria to grow even more and more better, right? So, um, now related to antibiotic resistance, of course, over time you have um, advances in medicine, You have these antibiotics, right? It was basically medication that enables a patient to get better by destroying or slowing down the growth of bacteria, right? Antibiotics usually refers to bacterial medicine, right? Antibacterial medicine, but you can have different types of medicine. Antimycotics, right? Antifungal, which is antifungal medicine, right? Um, and so forth, right? So, uh, the problem with antibiotics is that if you overuse, you misuse them by taking too much, right? You can lead to an evolutionary, kind of chain where you would produce antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? In the early days when antibiotics were first made, it was quite effective, right? It was new to this whole group of life of bacteria, right? So antibiotics were just killing the bacteria, making patients well again, but as time passed, certain bacteria were naturally getting resistant, right? And the thing about these resistant bacteria, they would have some sequences of DNA that would be resistant to this particular molecule or something like that. And they would pass this gene, right, to other bacteria. Okay. So that would lead to basically an ineffectiveness of antibiotics over time. And you would just start creating more resilient, more resistant bacteria, you know, that are even being their populations are increasing. So you're kind of getting like super bacteria, if I can say, right? So another deal in terms of overuse, right, is that also, patients would prescribe certain antibiotics for like a complete course of 14 days that patients should be taking, you know, 200 milligrams of ampicillin over 14 days. A lot of patients, they get better over 3 days and they stop taking the course, right? Maybe some of you do that. Maybe some of your parents do that, right? But if you do that, you feel better, but you're not killing all of the pathogenic bacteria that are making you sick, right? So what happens is that those little ones that are thriving, right? Those weaker bacteria get killed, but the more resistant ones thrive, and you get these new populations, right? So essentially, in a nutshell, natural selection. Okay. That is why, um, and this is pretty much a hotspot in biomedical science is developing new medicines, right? We always have to be developing new medicines because not just bacteria, but different organisms they always get some type of immunity to the antibiotic, right? And again, just like natural selection, you have some a population of bacteria where you have strains or types of bacteria that are very sensitive to the antibiotic. They die. You have some that are resilient, right? Antibiotic resistant bacteria, so they would start to multiply, right? So you start to get a resistant population, and even this resistant strain or those bacteria that have a resistant gene can pass it to a sensitive strain or one bacteria that isn't resilient, right? And then you have like a massive population there. There are several ways in which a bacteria can get resistance, right? You do need to know this. Okay. Referred to as horizontal gene transfer, always relating to natural selection. There's several types. Okay. Um, as you see here in the picture, it's pretty much, sorry. Um, you have a bacterial transformation where just sections of DNA, right? You have these antibiotic resistant genes. When you have one particular bacteria that for whatever reason gets lies and there's, um, uh, perforations in the bacteria, the basically holes in the cell, some genes could just pass through and they can get inside another recipient bacteria, right? Um, they don't necessarily need to die out. Let's say electroporation, where heat shocking, you can open the pores and whatnot. right? And the gene will just fly into a bacteria. Okay, this is called transformation. We've done this in the pGlow experiment, in the CRISPR experiment, right? Bacterial transformation. Another way is by bacterial transduction. You're passing a gene, right, via bacterial viruses called bacteriophages or phages for short. And in one bacteria that is infected with this virus, these virus populations are growing within the bacteria. And as they're being assembled, they can collect a DNA strain for resistance, and then they pass it down to another bacteria. And instead of injecting the viral DNA, they just inject the resistant antibiotic strain, right? Not all the viruses can be assembled perfectly, right? Some of them accidentally can get that resistance gene. So this is called bacterial transduction. Okay. And, scientists have figured out this whole cycle and this whole process that they've been able to produce transgenic um, bacteria via this method, right, of using viruses, which is pretty cool. Um, Bacterial conjugation, you can have certain plasmids that carry a resistant gene, right? They can basically pass these plasmids via a special little kind of tunnel or tube, right? Is made by specialized little structures called pili or sex pili that enables two bacteria to temporarily fuse together, and one bacteria, which is the donor, can pass their DNA to the other recipient cell, right? You can think of it as a form of sexual reproduction, if I can say, right? Uh, it's called conjugation, bacterial conjugation. Okay, so make sure you know these three methods of gene transfer, and it's referred to as horizontal gene transfer because you're passing to a neighbor, right? Vertical gene transfer is when you pass from a parent to offspring. In this case, you just have two independent cells and you're horizontally transferring from the same generation, if I can say. Okay, good. All right. Another aspect of that can influence spread, right, is host susceptibility, right? Now I mentioned this before already in host population, pathogen populations, mode of transmission. Talking a little bit about the host population, we go into a little bit more detail in terms of how susceptible the hosts are to obtaining an infection, right? And there's some factors that influence this on susceptibility, right? You can have high population density, right? Now, this one we've talked about already, right? Poor living conditions and inadequate healthcare provision, right? So let's take a look. The United Nations predict that the world's urban population will double, right? Almost to 6.3 billion people, right? In 2050. Most of 50% more than 50% of the world's population live in an urban area, right? Populated areas. Okay. So you have this concept of, city living, this whole cityscape you see here. Look how dense just the buildings are. It's ridiculous, right? You have urbanization, right? And it's people living in cities. So what are some aspects to that? Is that you basically have high density living, right? Because there's high density living, there's a higher rate of contact between an infected individual and an uninfected individual, right? For any pathogen, right? That's just given. Higher density, you're more likely to get an infection, right? So the spread of infection is faster, okay? Aside from that, right, there's an increase of interactions between animals, right, humans, ecosystems in general, right? And if you remember from Unit 1, the only organism really in city ecosystems is the human, right? Of course, you do have some little pests that are going around, especially insects, right? That can serve as vectors. Okay. So outbreaks in the rural setting, right? Countryside, if I can say, right? they could be controlled relatively quickly because you don't have that many susceptible hosts, right? If you were to compare it to an urban area, right? There's just not that many individuals. It's pretty simple, right? Especially you can mitigate it if the mode of transmission is limited to direct contact or close contact, right? Since there isn't that many individuals, mode of transmission greatly decreases, right? But there's a great increase in population density, right? Um, you're most likely going to have a very efficient mode of transmission, right? And there's another problem related to population density is the idea of overwhelming vaccination programs, right? Um, there's more people than what we can give vaccines to in a certain period of time, right? And we were kind of seeing that with COVID, right? With everyone trying to get the vaccine as quickly as possible, right? So, aside from that, some places they weren't exercising herd immunity that well, right? So, limited vaccination programs, poor herd immunity practices would give a population more susceptibility to having an outbreak, right? And definitely that can occur more for airborne diseases, that you can get it by coughing and sneezing, like influenza, right? And influenza, we see it all the time passing by, right? Yearly, right? So, um, yeah, another related, infection is severe acute respiratory syndrome or SARS, right? Here, this is a particular infection that you would get. You could see well urbanization, globalization, and the level of spread of this particular disease, right? In this case, with SARS, right? The first person infected was lived outside, right? Outside a city in China. This person got treated in the city area and infected seven more people. And just with that initial spread, it spread across the world, right? Uh, um, yeah, it spread across the world, right? Very, very quickly, you can get a spread, right? So high density increases the chances of spread. Aside from that, poor living conditions, right? Especially in developed countries, or sorry, in developing countries, right? You can have a lead of spread of infectious diseases like tuberculosis and malaria, right? Very, very important, just hygiene, right? Just having good hygiene, right? A lot of countries, third world countries, right, have limited access to clean water, to treated water, right? So these are areas in which pathogens can easily thrive in and pass through, right? So um, aside from that, sanitation, right? Hygiene. How much do you clean, your certain area, surfaces, and so forth, wipe off surfaces? So generally, where you have urban slums, right, or um, poor locations, right? There's high levels of um, contaminants, right? Fecal matter in the water that is consumed by households. People just jump in dirty water and dirty rivers, streams, and whatnot, where you're passing down these pathogens from contaminated fecal material from livestock, from, I don't know, I don't want to say from livestock, um, and so forth that people would drink, right? So water, this is especially true for waterborne diseases, right? So they would have spread relatively fast in these conditions. Okay. Um, Again, developing countries, limited electricity, right? If you had electricity, you would be able to, boil water, right? And sterilize the water to drink, kill the microbes via heat treatment, right? And so forth. But some people don't even have a stable amount of electricity during the day. Lights will leave, the electricity will leave for like 8 hours, right? Come back whenever, I don't know, whenever it's possible. So you never know, when would be your chance to heat up water, right? So you can't kill microbes, you can't cook well, right? And so forth and so forth. Um, yeah, so poor hygienic conditions greatly affects spread of of pathogens, right? Aside from that, again, always talking about poor living conditions is nutrition, right? How can you develop a good immune system if you don't have the um the nutrients, the food, good sources of vitamins and minerals to essentially boost your immune system, right? So weak immune systems, weak individuals would be susceptible to more infectious diseases, right? Very common is diarrhea. Diarrhea is a disease that is caused by poor sanitation, right? You're getting just a little bacterial infection in your body, in your stomach. You lose, and you can easily get this disease, right? Uncooked food is uncooked well, right? It's not cooked well. It's uncooked, right? So, aside from that, poor living conditions, right? This one's quite an interesting one because I've seen this actually around in some neighborhoods in Japan. Extensive animal keeping, backyard farming, mixed production systems is also been associated has also been associated with disease risks. Some people in their household tend to have farm animals, right? We're like 5 blocks closer to the station where I live. Um, uh, it's weird. I can hear a chicken, can hear a rooster early morning, right? That is just making a bunch of noise. Um, because people are housing, you know, these little farm animals in their backyard, and usually, if I can say, in an unsanitized way, right? So just keeping these animals greatly can increase the chance of spreading disease, right? The avian flu virus, right? In Southeast Asia has been related to rice production, um, um, duck population density, human population density, right? Where you're having this kind of mixed animals living together with population density, right? Backyard poultry, again, like I mentioned before, is becoming more and more common, actually, right? In urban areas, not on your farm side, not on your country side, right? In urban areas, in city areas, right? So it's very important to evaluate that, to surveillance that, because you don't want hygienic, um, low hygiene situations that is spreading through household to household, right? Imagine if you're a neighbor to these particular people. So try to avoid that, right? It is important as a biosecurity measure, right? Hygiene practice, very, very important, right? Um, and so forth. Okay. Oops. All right. So just this last part on, um, factors that influence spread of disease, right? Of host susceptibility, right? Is lack of adequate healthcare provision. Very, very important. We're lucky that in Japan you do have a relatively good, healthcare, and you have health insurance that we could all easily go and get medicine whenever we can, right? Um, uh, and get the medicine, right? But it isn't that easy for other countries, right? Where it's completely absent in some cases, right? So medicine, vaccines, bandages, generic, antibiotics, and so forth, antimycotics, anti-parasitic medicine, all of these things that we kind of take for granted, some people don't have access at all. Sorry, don't have access at all, right? So definitely healthcare is very, very important for the spread of disease, right? And kind of maintaining the spread. Okay. So um healthcare services, right, which includes, vaccines and medicine and bandages, also includes hospitals and professional healthcare provision, right? They're referred to as provision, right? So poor healthcare increases the susceptibility to infectious diseases, right? So as poor healthcare increases, there's an increase in susceptibility to get infected, right? That's just, quite straightforward, right? Because you have limited access to all these services, right? To all these provisions here. Okay. Um, Same case of COVID, right? In Nicaragua, we had a it was a delay in getting vaccinations, right? In these third world countries, right? Um, yeah, and that would make people more vulnerable to these particular diseases. Okay. And if less people are vaccinated, right, that increase the risks of spreading, right? There's a higher proportion, a possibility of a susceptible individual. Okay. And again, if you're not vaccinated, right, vaccination induces this idea of herd immunity that we're going to take a look at. So if you're not vaccinated, there's going to be a low herd immunity in the area, right? Or in the country that is basically having these situations, right? So as more people become infected, fewer people have access to medicine, right? There's just less available for each individual person if more people are infected, right? So little can be done to slow the spread. And then that will create a cycle and more spread, which will lead to an epidemic, spread to neighboring countries, lead to a pandemic, right? So it's pretty tough, right? The capacity to pay for healthcare is determined by unfortunately status, right? Social economic status, right? And um who are the most vulnerable people, right? Relatively young individuals, children, right? Especially if they have um um low food, low energy, vitamins and just food and nutrients, minerals, right? They're going to be more susceptible to being infected, right? The elderly also on the other side of the spectrum, right? Their whole immune system generally goes down, and other individuals like the immunocompromised or the unimmunized, right? So if you remember during the early days of the vaccination, the first people that were getting the vaccines were the elderly, right? So yeah, some examples of these diseases, right, that are related to poverty, right, or poor developing countries is malaria, right? Um, and tuberculosis, right? Malaria and tuberculosis, you could prevent malaria by just having physical barriers and medication. There are some anti-malarial medications, right? Tuberculosis can be and respiratory diseases can be improved by having good immune systems and nutrition. Okay. So, and these are the general factors that influence spread, right? Um, Population of the pathogen, population of the host, and the mode of transmission. Then within these three, you have these other factors that just influence everything, right? Globalization, antibiotics, climate change for certain diseases, right? So make sure you're familiar with that, that you can be able to discuss. Okay. All right, guys. So with that being said, we finished chapter 13. Sorry, it ended up being a little bit longer than what I anticipated. And in the next video, we'll talk about chapter 14, which is pathogen management strategies. Okay. All right, guys. And I'll see you in the next video.